All right, folks, thanks for joining today. We'll just give a couple more minutes here for folks to be able to join. I know sometimes when meetings start right at noon, it's hard for folks to get there right on time. So we'll just wait another minute or two here and be starting in just a moment. So thank you for joining. All right, I see we're a few minutes past the hour, so we'll go ahead and get started. So greetings everyone today. My name's Trevor Coons, and I am one of the volunteers with the uh, local Minnesota chapter HIMSS board, and so it's my pleasure to be facilitating today's event. So again, thank you for joining Minnesota HIMSS today for our third and final webinar for our series focused on medical device security from the folks at CynergisTek. Today's topic will be focusing on program development. The first two webinars have been recorded and are accessible on our website. We will be recording this event and making this available to all of our Minnesota HIMSS members. If you would like to be a speaker or a sponsor for a future webinar event, please reach out to us via our webpage, Minnesota or mn.himsschapter.org. Also, we will do a question and answer session at the end. Be sure to type in your questions in the question section of the GoToWebinar application, and you can wait till the end to type those in, or during the meeting you can type those in, and I'll be sure to keep track of them, and we'll try and get to as many as we can. But today, again, I'm pleased to introduce our speakers. They are Matt Dimino and Carrie Weishall. And Matt is an advocate to help our nation's healthcare and our public health sector recognize and prepare for tomorrow's cyber threats. Matt is a medical device security consultant at CynergisTek and is a top rank or at the top ranked cybersecurity firm. Matt's prolific 13-year career involves roles such as clinical engineer, professor, and researcher, and consultant for a not-for-profit public health and safety organization. Mr. Dimino holds a bachelor's degree in clinical engineering and an MBA in healthcare, and has earned numerous IT security industry certifications. He, motivated by work that makes a difference, Mr. Dimino is proud to continue research and extend his expertise in the domains of education, medical device, cyber threat mitigation, and the implementation of prevention strategies. Carrie Weishall is the Director of Managed Security Services for CynergisTek. She's responsible for vendor security management, managed security service, and medical device security, a healthcare veteran of over 20 years of experience in IT leadership, 12 of which have been specifically in security. Prior to joining CynergisTek, Carrie served as a senior director of security for Essentia Information Services, and during her time there, she was part of the leadership team that implemented Essentia's Security Operations Center, or their SOC, as well as the company's eForensics, security training and awareness, as well as medical device management program. Finally, also was involved with the creation of the incident response programs. Carrie was also responsible for the Access and Identity Management Program, which provided identity and access services for over 200,000 users across the Ascension system. Thank you both, Matt and Carrie, and we are pleased to have you start.
Thank you. This is Carrie, and I'm going to try to live up to that bio. It's very long, so I apologize for that. But thank you for joining us for our little mini-series that is medical device security. I'd probably classify us as a drama, probably wouldn't rate higher than live PD or maybe fire rescue, but I bet we would at least outrank the latest documentary on this new wormholes in space. So let's get that started. As with most presentations, there's a lot of data in these slides. So I'm not going to go through the entire agenda. We'll treat it as a little preview to the show. Everybody watches it, but they don't care. They really want to get to the show. So with that said, next slide, Matt. And the next one. All right, so let's talk about why is it hard to secure a medical device. We're security masters. I mean, we can lock down a laptop. I can use EDR. I can even find that laptop after you steal it on the internet using tools like Carbon Black or CrowdStrike. I can't do that with a medical device. And there's lots of reasons why we can't do that. I wish we could, but I'm going to try not to cry. So what we really have to deal with here, probably the top couple things here, are that most of the operating systems on these devices are end of life by the time you get them. And there's a big reason for that. These devices are very, very expensive. You're talking linear accelerators, ultrasound machines, anesthesia machines. When they're purchasing these machines, they're expecting a longer ROI. But that also means that now you've got to put up with that operating system throughout the entire life of that device. And most manufacturers for operating systems aren't really concerned about security. They're concerned about the device working when they sold it and being the back end. Microsoft, well, they have extended a few at times. For WannaCry, they did come back out with some patches for 98, which was good on them. So, but for the most part, they're really not concerned with what's embedded in your medical device. You really can't put them in any kind of EDR program. The most you can really do is try to segment them or maybe use whitelisting. But the other piece that's a problem is there's no real remote management for these devices. Now, can your vendor get in and support some of the bigger devices? Yes. But could you remote in and support a glucose meter? No. But do you need to support that glucose meter and keep it safe? Absolutely. So it's a little bit tricky from all of our normal tips and tricks that we do for devices. And then the last one that still drives me totally insane is we have not come up with a way to get the vendors to agree to allow us to encrypt these devices. If you could encrypt the hard drive, you wouldn't panic as much when it walked away. The first question when you lose a laptop at one of your sites is, was it encrypted? Great, no OCR phone call. When a managed medical device walks away, not so much. Everyone starts panicking and tries to figure out what that device did and what was on it. So really, at the end of the day, it's all about taking care of the patients. It's really not about being secure. But there are a couple things that you need to think about when you're trying to secure a device. And Matt, if you can go to the next slide. And that is making sure that you're looking at all of the risk areas. We all think about patient safety. We all think about unauthorized access. They're just there. They're part of our life. Everyone's talking about being hacked. Everyone's talking about ransomware. When you add in the medical device, you never want to do something to that device that's going to risk the safety of the patient that's on the other side of the device. So those two are usually ones that we pay a lot of attention to. The other two, though, financial loss and availability, those two kind of take a back seat, and until recently. So when you think about a financial loss for a device today, you probably just think about physically losing the device. Where did a device go? But what you really need to be thinking about is what was on the device when it disappeared, and do I have the potential to have a data breach? If that device shows up on eBay tomorrow and somebody powers it up and it has the name of your health system on it, what is that going to do to you? And we're not just talking about the data that's on the device. The other piece that you need to think about for financial loss is PR. What's it going to do to your health system when somebody publishes that they have one of your devices with your patient information on it and they bought it on eBay? So there's a lot of pieces in there in financial loss that we really don't think about. For any of us that lived through WannaCry, and we're still having nightmares occasionally about that, you understand that you had to defer patients because your machine couldn't work. There was so much traffic, they couldn't see the network to even get up to work. So a lot of hospitals had to defer patients from their ERs. They had to defer tests to other sites. A lot of those folks had to defer them even out of network because they didn't have a close enough hospital. So it is a big piece that we kind of forget about when we're trying to secure these devices. And the second, of course, and really probably the one that we think about the least, is availability. Medical devices have kind of always been there. They've always been by the bedside. Most of them can work if they're not connected to the internet. Some of them can't, but an infusion pump, if it can't connect to the network, nobody cares. If an ultrasound can't connect to the network, we might not care that first day, but we're going to start caring the second or third day because each of those devices only has so many tests that it can store online. When you start getting to that second and third day and you don't still have an answer good enough to put that device back on or get the device cleaned and back on, now you're going to go back to the financial loss circle. So there are a lot of pieces that need to be taken into account. And I think as long as you're looking at that very middle square and you're getting at least a little piece of each one of them, you're going to have a better all-around program. Next slide, please. So let's talk about what a program needs to have. So there are a lot of pieces that can be put together around medical device security. You could just buy a tool. You could buy a tool, throw it on the network, run your first accounting, and have heart attacks like most people do. But that's only one piece of the problem. You need to take a look at this as 3 different stages. First, you need to assess what risk you have. Look at the total risk. Don't just look at the technical risk. Look at your program risk. What policies, procedures, standards, what are you missing that if you did get your technical risk cleaned up, how would you keep it cleaned up? So if you think about it as a program, you're going to look at the tool, you're going to get all the data you can out of it, you're going to build a remediation plan, but then what do? If you don't have a program, number one, you're not monitoring how you're doing on your remediation, but number 2, you're not stopping the bleeding. So you did all this work, you put the tool in, you figured out what was bad on your network, and then you stop. If you make the time and you develop the program behind that, now you've got policies, procedures, you're going to pull in procurement, you want to stop buying end-of-life devices if you can. Always take a look and do an assessment before you buy it. Try and stop the bleeding. So once you do get it cleaned up and you kind of have a level set, now tomorrow there'll be a 0 day aimed at medical devices. We all know that. But if you're at least in a better place where you're managing and monitoring those devices, you've got a better shot at it. The other piece about the program development brings in kind of your asset management strategy, and that's an important part for these devices. How do you know where these assets are? How do you know what they are? Are you taking this information that you're getting from the tool and putting it in your CMDB? Something as simple as that. And let me tell you why that matters. You have a device, someone calls the help desk and says, I can't get on the network. They may or may not say it's a medical device. They may just say we can't work. Or you may have a whole area that's down, workstations and medical devices, and everybody's calling in. Now the service desk gets that call, they're going to route it to IT, when the root probably was the medical device that got infected first. But if they look in their CMDB, they don't have any information on that medical device. They might have an IP address, but I doubt it says this is an ultrasound machine and it's on this floor, in this room, on that switch, on that port. You need that level of information because when you have an incident, you're going to save yourself, on average, I'd say somewhere around 20 to 30 minutes because you're not searching for this device. Even if you knew it's been blocked out as a medical device from your vulnerability scanning, you don't know what it is. You still have to find somebody to go decide what to do. Imagine how much faster that would be if your help desk brought it up out of the CMDB, said it's an ultrasound. There was a note in there that said it could run for 3 days without being on the network, and you could immediately turn around and turn that port off. Take a deep breath, and then go figure out what happened. It's a totally different way to look at how you use that data. And that's part of the program. You'd make sure that that data is getting updated. You would pick your source of truth, whether it's the final record in the CMDB, is it the record in your tool that's gathering the medical data, is it your CMS database for your medical device team? What's the source of truth, but make sure that you've got all of those things talking to each other. The other thing that the program does is really help you get to a baseline configuration. You need to be able to say, every device that comes into our network is going to have these ports turned off. We're going to have these protocols turned off. We're going to set up a standard network segment for these folks. That's where these devices go. And by the way, when you set up a network, don't put everybody in one segment. It is not segmenting if you create a medical device segment and then you put them all on there. All that really did is when one gets infected, now everybody's down and now the whole hospital's down. So be smart about how you segment that. But once you have those base configurations done, most of the tools that are on the market today will allow you to enter that base configuration into the tool. And then it will let you look for anomalies. And that becomes part of your program. You're running these reports, you're seeing these anomalies. Every time you see that you have a new device added out of standards, you're going to go talk to that group. You're going to say, hey, how did this get on the network? What did we do? And you'll keep refining that process. The last piece of it is just managing the program. Consistently do what you've set up. Get a steering committee, get a governance committee. Make sure that you have all of the right people talking to the right people. Your governance committee should be security, it should be medical device, it should be procurement. At a minimum, you have to have your procurement people in there. They're making decisions every day about what devices are going to stay, what devices are going to go, what budget do they have to buy next year's devices. Those people have a lot of power. They also have a lot of power at the time of purchase. So imagine the power you would have if part of your program develops a technical assessment. These are the top 10 things that you want to ask when a device gets purchased. And these are my top 10 things that are showstoppers. I am not bringing in a Windows 98 device. Please, God, let that be on there anyway. But to that effect, we're not bringing in Windows 98. We're not bringing in Windows 7, although that would be a very tough sell today. We want these ports turned off. We don't ever want to see a device talking over 443. whatever it is that are your base minimums, if you can get your purchasers to run that assessment ahead of you with their vendors and say, here's the base that we'll accept, you'll start getting cleaner purchasing from the get-go. And then there may be some where they might meet 8 out of the 10. You might have to negotiate as a governance body, but that is a much better place to be in than, I don't know, the doctor wanted it, so we went with it. So just think about when you're looking at medical device security, you need to have all 3 of these components if you're going to have a successful program. Next slide. So let's get a little bit farther into what that program development piece looks like. So you've already done your technical assessment. You already know, here's the level of risk that's in my environment. How do you start that circle, and where do you start to kind of look at this as a life cycle for the medical device? So like we talked about on the last slide, you're going to talk about how does it get on my network, and how do I keep the inventory of that device current? What are my installation parameters, and what do I need to do to manage the life cycle of that asset in my inventory? And that could be 1 spot, it could be 3 spots. I personally think the CMDB should be the first stop, but depending on how your environment is, you may think that the CMS database for now is a better place to put it, and you have good communication with that team, so you feel comfortable with that. The next one is really around the maintenance piece. So the tool is running, it's looking at what you're doing every day. You know what your internal security risk level is. We say posture on the slide, but it's really more about what is the level of risk that your organization is willing to accept. Is it high? In healthcare, the answer is absolutely not. We just can't afford for it to be high. So typically healthcare is somewhere to a medium low. We can't ever really be low, since the average age of our applications is somewhere between 12 and 15 years. So we're always going to have somewhere around medium, but understanding where is your organization's risk stance, that will help you stay in that support maintenance circle. You've set a minimum of what you'll accept, and you're not going outside of that. The next piece is really thinking about that incident response that we talked about. You need to make sure that medical devices are part of your incident response plan. Everybody has a plan or a playbook, you can call it whichever you like, but there needs to be a section in that playbook, in the IT playbook, for medical device security. Sometimes people talk about having a separate section for medical device and then keeping the IT incident response plan clean. I can tell you personally that doesn't work, because if it's not part of your evaluation criteria when you kick off the incident, someone's going to forget about it. They're going to forget that this other piece of the plan is over here. Let's go look at this other piece of the plan. Everybody focuses on your main plan during an incident. The more that you can get medical device security into your main plan, the better you're going to be. It's going to be part of something you think about every time you have an incident. It will be in your criteria for your top 10 seconds after an incident, and those top 10 questions that you ask. Number 10 should be, is this a medical device? Then the last piece, and it's one that I think we kind of forget about when it comes to medical devices, but we're really, really aware of it when it comes to the rest of our IT hardware, and that's disposition and retirement. The one piece that's in the middle of that, and the medical devices are unique for that, is the media sanitization. So we all know before that PC leaves our site, we're wiping that hard drive. Whether we're doing it, our vendor's doing it, we've got a contract for somebody to do it, that device is going to get wiped. Same process with our servers. We know that. But medical devices are a little unique. And the biggest piece of that is that there are lots of medical devices that are not managed by anyone at your health system. Not medical device, not security. So who's managing these devices? Vendors. And those typically are in our shadow IT areas where you may have cardiology or radiology. They have their own IT team. A vendor comes in, he's working on a device, decides, I give up. I can't fix this. I'm going to replace the device. Puts a new one in, walks out with the old one. Did anybody say, hey, we have a standardization policy, and as part of our BAA with you, you have to agree to follow all of our security processes, which include media standardization, and medical devices are included in that media standardization policy? I would bet today, if you go back and look at your overall IT policy, it's not there. But I'm hoping within the next few weeks you get it in there because it's a big deal and it's something that happens a lot. Most of the devices that you'll find out on eBay weren't a device that clinical engineering supported. They were a device that a vendor supported and a vendor walked away with. So it's a big area of risk for medical devices. Next slide, Matt. So one last piece here to talk about the approach for how you realize the level of risk that you actually have in your organization. And there are pieces that you have to have in order to understand at the end of the day, right there in red, what is the level of risk that this device is bringing into our environment. So you want to take a look at, how does this device use the network? Does it have any security parameters at all? I'm going to tell you right now, 90% the answer is no, but you ask the question. Can I patch it? Can I mitigate it if I can't patch it? What are my mitigation strategies? Then really, how well am I monitoring my risk? What am I doing to prevent the risk that this device is bringing into our organization? Most of that box for monitoring and remediation and prevention is going to happen out of the tool, but there are some that you're going to have to manage. You're going to have to manage how you segment these devices. You're going to have to look at, are you doing whitelisting? Are you just doing ACL blocking? What are you doing for that? Then the last piece here up in the far right corner that we kind of forget about a little bit is, what else is this device talking to? So you might have secured the device and maybe you whitelisted something, but did you look at what it's talking to? Where is it sending information? Who is it talking to? And it doesn't necessarily need to be talking outside of your network. If that medical device is talking to 3 workstations, did you make sure all 3 workstations were protected? All 3 workstations were as secure as you could make them? Or did you only focus on that one medical device? Because if you didn't, as soon as that device is compromised, everything connected to it is compromised as well. You also want to see what's the ability for that device to be maneuvered on the network. So if they could get into that device and they could get to one of those 3 workstations, what else could they get to? Are any of those workstations set up with administrator? Now that's a whole different ball of wax, and it definitely changes the level of risk that that device is bringing into your organization. So always make sure that you have a multi-layered approach. You don't want to just look at one piece. There are multiple pieces that make up the level of risk. And really, in most of the conversations, we would call this the risk score for the device. Now, there are 2 actual risk scores. One is your security risk. One is your patient safety risk. But today we're scaring you enough with the security risk. We won't go into the patient safety risk. That's another presentation for later. Next slide, Matt. All right, so next up, all of these conversations have been building up towards, how do you analyze the risk? What's the risk score that we're trying to get to, and how do we get there? So to tell you how to get there, I'm going to turn this over to my partner, Matt.
All right, thank you, Carrie. Yes, thank you. So the goal is, with the risk analysis methodology, is to come up with a way to quantify, a way to classify and categorize the assets. So, Carrie built the foundation as far as the processes, procedures, the different people involved, and having your documents and ducks in a row. But now there's another process here, and this risk analysis methodology, again, to help you identify and categorize your assets, so you can kind of come to a multi-dimensional approach to start to remediate. And this methodology here is kind of based on the NIST risk management framework. But something to kind of clarify right off the bat here is risk analysis and risk assessments are often used interchangeably, but a risk assessment describes the overall process that encompasses risk identification, risk analysis, and risk evaluation. So risk analysis refers to determining the nature and level of risk. And that's what we're trying to do, is determine that level of risk so we know how to prioritize and we know what we want to do when we try to remediate. And one of these processes here is system characterization. And with that, we have, like, with all of these phases here, you could say we have an input and we have an output. So something with system characterization is we might even use some of these passive scanning solution tools that we've talked about. We'll use things like our CMMS or CMDB, and we're going to gather data, right? We're going to gather information like hardware, software, system interfaces, the SBOM, and other kinds of pieces of information about the particular asset or medical device in this case. And then we might actually come up with an output from the system categorization. So what we'll do is we might utilize, again, our tools. We might utilize the passive scanning solution to kind of find a system boundary, to find a system function, and help us with sensitivity, right? So determine who are we talking to? What are we talking with? How often are we talking? How much data are we sending and receiving? So that's kind of our system characterization process. And then our threat identification is really just that, is looking at the full spectrum of threats. So this isn't just what's in the hospital. Heck, this could be natural, this could be criminal, this could be terrorist, and even accidental. And this assessment should really examine supporting information to evaluate the relative likelihood and occurrence for each threat. But with the threat identification is we're kind of looking at maybe history. We're looking at threat intel feeds. So we'll have an individual, or again, we'll use the tools or passive scanning solutions to help us get a more granular feed. So we want that intel to come in, and so we can process that information. Otherwise, it's a very manual process of kind of going out, looking at threat intel, and then kind of looking at it from a business impact analysis, and then looking at all the other parameters, right? Even if you start to include clinical and nursing and visitors in the outside environment here, it's a very big approach. It's a very strong approach and rather difficult. So trying to use some of the tools that we've discussed over the past two or so webinars to help you identify some of your threats. And then looking at the vulnerability, and this is the identification and analysis. So we might actually use your past risk assessments, anything prior, kind of pull in and pull over, and then start to look at those vulnerabilities that are out there. So again, the threat intels, what is actually applicable to our devices? What do we have that's affected by these, right? So we might have several thousand or just 1,200, 1,500 medical devices. How many of them are impacted? Where and what are impacted? And what kind of protocols are impacted? What part of our system characterization and threat identification kind of rolls in with the vulnerability is understanding what, when, where, how, and why. And then we'll look into our control analysis. So when we have a kind of a picture of what we have, we know what our system looks like, our medical device, we kind of know what threats might be prone to attacking this device. And then we have a vulnerability analysis, right? What kind of CVSS scores are we talking about? What kind of vulnerabilities are actually applicable to this device? And then kind of creating almost a hack value, right? What is the hack value of this device? Is this something that could be of ease or really challenging, but it's a honeypot. It's full of goodies that somebody may want. And again, with control analysis, we're going to be looking at what controls do we already have in place? What tools are available? Do we have a network access control solution? Do we have other firewalls or next generation firewalls? What do we have that we can use to help us from our previous analysis and characterization? When we gather that kind of data, do we have something that can help us with that currently? And if we don't, what will? What is out there that we could look at? And then we kind of look at the likelihood. What is it with the likelihood that we want? You know, what's the chances of this occurring? What is the motivation, right? The capacity and whatnot within an asset or within the device itself. And impact is critical as well. So knowing what would, could, or should happen if these other events occur. So the impact could be multidimensional, and I'll cover this, I believe, in the next slide or two. Is, you know, are we looking at business impact? Are we looking at patient impact? Are we looking at data impact? You know, all those factors have to play into this. So, you know, having each one of those into this impact analysis kind of helps create the almost the business impact analysis to put within our methodology here. And then that kind of helps us with our risk determination. So we've got our likelihood of the threat being exploited, and we've got somewhat of our magnitude or impact, and then we've kind of evaluated our controls already as well. So what's the adequacy of planned or current controls? And our output really at this point is risk and associated risk levels. This really helps us identify and define where we stand now. Are we going to put this as a number value? Or are we going to put this as a critical, high, medium, low? You know, what is it that our organization wants to do when we have this information for a device? And then one of these other pieces is the controls recommendation. So we might have something that scores really high from a risk perspective. Let's say it's 9, or we consider 9 to be critical. What controls are recommended to remediate? What could we do to effectively get that down to where we're more comfortable within our appetite? And so those controls, again, are either what we already have available to us that we can reuse, or what controls do we need to get new to implement to help with this? And even with that, you know, when we start to maybe even categorize systems by almost models on some occasion, we'll be able to put them together and maybe utilize more than one control for one asset. We might be able to utilize one control for numerous or a block of assets. And then, of course, documentation. Without documentation, this it all kind of falls apart. So sharing the information, communicating all this information out to the appropriate parties is detrimental. So your communities of interest, your stakeholders are really going to need and want to know this information so you can proceed further in your remediation process. And so again, here's our risk criteria. So likelihood of the threat occurrence. And a lot of things you look at is the active vulnerabilities. And, you know, this is a challenging component to this. So having someone or a team of someone's or groups, you know, kind of looking at the active vulnerabilities for your assets is a huge challenge. It's an undertaking. So sometimes, again, utilizing the tool sets that you might have or looking to purchase, like the passive scanning solution tools, that can maybe help filter some of that for you. And they can kind of help categorize or put active vulnerabilities and associate those to the devices that you have based upon the system characterization. So it really helps filter out all the other nonsense that may not really apply. And you're kind of going to build a network profile. So it's similar to system characterization, where you know what your device is talking to, you know who it's talking to, what it's talking to, and how often, and how much data. Is it going outbound? Is it inbound? You know, those kinds of attributes are critical in determining the likelihood, right? If you're not really chatty and you're not connected to 100 different neighbors or even 20 different neighbors and devices, and you're pretty siloed, your likelihood is a lot less. So you can kind of weigh that factor in when you look at these things. And your security capabilities. And this is critical too, where you want to and need to look at the MDS2 documents, or the MDS squared documents. And these documents really help provide that well-rounded approach to securing your device, because it tells you what attributes are available of the device or what security capabilities the device has. So if you don't know what security capabilities the device has, you don't really have a good idea of what controls might be applicable, because it might have those onboard controls that you can just turn on and manipulate or maneuver yourself. And so having that stuff documented and knowing what's available and what's not really helps out with that likelihood. And then with that is the compensating controls. So those are kind of the outside the box type controls. So if the device doesn't have certain capabilities, it may not have certain tools on the network, you may look outside the box. So you might consider a next generation firewall, right? So you might have a real high likelihood, high impact, really critical, high utilization asset, and you may not have the security capabilities within the asset or within the device itself to change the threat landscape to reduce the risk profile. And so implementing compensating controls maybe right there at the asset might be what's most likely, right? You know, a great example that I have is in the past I had a mammography film printer, and it was Windows NT 5.0. And the physician absolutely had to have this device. There's no way around it. And there was, I guess, no money at the time to purchase something new. And this doctor was a surgeon. She refused to do surgery without printing off film from this device. And because it was so specific to her field, there was just no argument around it. So we didn't have the controls available at the time. And compensating controls, putting the firewalls right there at the device, blocking all the ports, turning off everything, only allowing this device and the workstation she works at to communicate together, and that was it. Really helped reduce that risk with that device. And then the potential impact of the threat occurrence. And these are the factors you need to look at is your patient impact. What would happen if something occurred? What would happen if the asset's taken down? What happened, or what would happen if something was modified? You have to weigh that in your calculations to help determine your risk criteria. And your business impact, what would it do to your organization? Do you have 500 of these devices floating around? An infusion pump, for instance, is this a device that you've got so many of them where one going down is okay? We're okay with that. Or again, being an MRI or a linear accelerator where you only have 1, 2, or 3, and that system goes down. That impact is critical. And same thing with data. A lot of these imaging devices that we see store a massive amount of records. A lot of these EKG systems that are floating around on carts that look like laptops that have SD cards inside of them, have hundreds and hundreds of records. So understanding what the impact is with the data or the device and how much data it holds is part of that risk criteria. So kind of determining your levels of risk. So here's a basic heat map that we'll see everywhere. You'll find these in all kinds of textbooks and all over the internet, but it's just kind of helping you visualize your likelihood and impact when you start to do these calculations. So being able to just map this out, being able to visually show this to your stakeholders, right? We can write reports all day long. We can come up with 30, 40, 60, 90-page reports, but it's very challenging, and the level of effort to read the report is so hard that not everyone will want to read thoroughly. So being able to provide some visuals, an indication of how we determine the impact and the likelihood, showing it on the heat map here kind of helps individuals who are in those seats understand where we stand. So kind of showing that high to medium criticality of the likelihood and impact of this asset or the risk to this asset is paramount, really, in the motivation to move forward and to get remediation strategies and get others involved with remediation strategies. So risk categorization and establishing a classification or categorization for risk, it enables us to describe risks in a manner that facilitate prioritization and, again, escalating the organization's response in controlling our risks. And this diagram here shows kind of two different methods and two different looks here. And the diagram on the right is more model-based. And so you have a percentage, and what we've done is we've broken it down to high, moderate, and low. And rather than putting in each individual asset, let's just say you're new in your program, and at this point you've come up with your calculations, and now you have these groupings of assets that, again, would most likely be model-based to help you kind of show your stakeholders here, I've got 29% of my systems in a high risk category. And with that, we just kind of indicate X-ray systems or ultrasound. You may have 3 or 4 different models of ultrasound. So in reality, when you're going to start to remediate, you really want to get pretty granular with it. But when you're in your initial phases and you're just starting your initial assessment and you need the groundwork and the footwork, this method is perfectly okay to start with. The item or the image here on the left is specific to an asset. And this just kind of the score is medium, right? So the same thing if we have a high, medium, or low and critical, this asset would represent itself in the medium category. And this kind of shows based upon vulnerabilities and severity and the network profile. But the goal is this is specific to one particular device. So if we have that same device and we have it somewhere else, or it's in a different segment, or it may have different controls, compensating controls in place, its risk score could be higher or lower. So sometimes the environment, it really is going to play a key role in this. So if you have an asset that is really well isolated, there's really no physical access. So you might have a whole bunch of vulnerabilities that are associated with this device, but let's just say it's really well locked down. No one's coming in that room. There are no USB ports on it. It doesn't really talk on the network. Those kinds of attributes and things prevent and reduce that risk. So that score will be much different than maybe the same type of asset sitting up in the ICU that's freely available to patients and staff and caregivers and visitors and anyone really walking through the door that wants to go see or view, that information or that device. So that score could be much higher. And that's kind of what this represents. This is more of a single asset here on the left versus category or groupings there on the right. So medical device threat modeling, and this is something that we would do with your program. So this is what you would look at from a data collection standpoint. So you really need to know where you stand, and what with that we have to collect the data from the devices. So the data is also collected from the threat feeds, correlating that information with one another, right? So utilizing, again, maybe a passive scanning solution can help with that data correlation. So you know what devices you have, you know where they stand, and you know what kind of threat intel we have. You also want to use, as mentioned, that CMMS database that biomed or medical engineering or clinical engineering has. That CMMS database really is their bread and butter, where a lot of their key attributes are there. They're always going to have their serial numbers and things like that in there. They don't have those other attributes, most likely. So that's why you'll use multiple sources to collect data from. And I have on here, the next step here is that establish that hypotheses. What are you hunting for? What are you looking for? What are you modeling? What are the threats? You have to kind of develop a meaningful strategy. Just going into this blind doesn't necessarily work. So you have to understand device activity. You have to understand normalization. What's right from wrong? What is the device supposed to be doing? You have to do some investigation, and you have to define what you're hunting or what purpose. And again, with that, you have that meaningful strategy. So what are you going to do with all that information? And then you kind of have this hunting phase, right, where you want to interpret results from data collection, and you want to do an analysis and forensics. You want to go out and continue to look. You want to evaluate. You want to provide that analysis and interpret those results. So what's legit and what's not, and how are you affected? And what is the impact of these threats? And again, how likely is it to occur? And that's part of your analysis and forensics with that. And then the threat detection. So how does the threat affect the device? How does it affect your organization? What methods are used, such as what ports and protocols are used, right? So you also want to, I guess, kind of look at these false positives, because you're going to be hit with so much information. How do you filter that information? And I've mentioned that some of those passive scanning solution tools can filter that for you, or you can define some of those filters, but it is still a process where someone has to go in and evaluate. So if you have a product that might have a particular, 4.1.7 application on there, and everything affected by a particular vulnerability is 4.1.6 and below. So, your solution might indicate, well, this could be viable, this could be vulnerable, but you have to actually go in and verify and validate and go, oh, well, no, this is a 4.1.7. So no, that this isn't. So I can remove that threat or that vulnerability from this list. And then you're kind of looking at the response piece. You want to evaluate the remediation with actionable responses. You want to, what are we going to do? Are we going to update? Are we going to patch? Are we going to change some sort of configuration? And I think we've discussed this so much now that updating and patching doesn't really occur anymore. Most of our devices are end of life. A lot of our devices are floating around with Windows 7. Windows 7 stopped offering support back in January of 2020 this year. So that's not necessarily feasible. Those vulnerabilities are still going to continue to come out on a regular basis. So you have to have that response, that remediation action plan that you want to do for next steps. So this is still part of the threat modeling. So this is just a couple of images looking at that data. So with using maybe a passive scanning solution tool, we have a diagram on the left, and this is just a world map, but what this is to kind of show that you can take a very particular device and you can see who, what, when, where, and why it's communicating with. So you can determine if you have a device communicating outside of your network, what country, what geolocation, is it inbound, outbound, what ports and protocols, and how much throughput, right? What is that, how much actual data is there? So that's kind of part of your threat modeling or hunting for that matter. And on the right is just another graph or diagram showing threats or vulnerabilities that might be associated with your device. So the picture here is one device with different vulnerabilities that may be applicable to it. So this particular product has indicated, there's an IoT, there's a clinical, mostly clinical and IoT vulnerabilities that are associated with this. So is there an ICSMA association with this device. And you can even see there's an acknowledgement over here where I think at some point in time someone's gone in and said, yeah, I acknowledge that. That's true or valid or whatever it may be with this product. So it's a platform for you to again, pull that information in those feeds, evaluate, check the box, and go, okay, cool, this is not applicable or it is applicable and it's been taken care of. And when you start to do those things, it starts to help with your risk profile. It starts to help with those risk scores that we've talked about. So you can take your high or critical to a medium or moderate or wherever you really want to be within your appetite within your organization. Okay. So Carrie really hit home on a lot of the policies and procedures. So realistically, what I'm going to talk about here are the roles and responsibilities. And with that, we kind of look at our governance. And this, to me, and personally, is one of the biggest deals and the most important aspects and pieces to have. Because with everything we've told you, with everything we've shared with you, not one single individual can do that alone. It doesn't matter who you are within your organization, your CISO, your biomed director, your IS security director, not one individual can manage all the pieces we just talked about without having a group of individuals and all the stakeholders coming together. So that steering committee really comes into play. And with that steering committee, the only way you're going to put this together is if you have these pieces, this puzzle all put together to be able to move forward and do the action items that we've discussed. So coming up with that key document, which will identify your objectives and or your deliverables. You know, what are the goals? What are we going to do with this? And which rolls into a purpose, right? So the purpose of the steering committee is XYZ. We want to remediate or mitigate medical device security risks. How often are we going to meet? What's our cadence look like? You know, we want to be very thorough, but at the same time, we want to make sure we accomplish things. I think we've all known and been and sat through meetings where you're just scratching your head, wondering what you're doing there and why, because we're not accomplishing anything. So with this meeting cadence, you want to accomplish specific tasks. So you'll also do policy approval. So pretty much everything Carrie talked about most likely will be approved through the steering committee because biomed can't go and make all these changes without the approval from others or without impacting others and vice versa. So if IS and IT start making changes in policies that biomed can't adhere to, it just won't work. So having a scope also, what is the scope of the whole program? What does that look like? Having sponsors. So different stakeholders will be your sponsor. Your CISO might be your sponsor. Maybe you have a chief nursing officer. Maybe you have someone from the clinical side, as mentioned, or physician or whomever. Having a sponsor who's on board with the mission and goals and objectives of this committee is key. And then having different leads from your groups. And every organization is going to be different size and scope. So if you're a small organization, you may not have a whole bunch of leads, but maybe a key stakeholder from each department, and then multiple people from that department will be part of the steering committee. And that's what the membership kind of holds. One of the most challenging documents, in my opinion, but also one of the most helpful, is the Racy Matrix. So the Racy assists in outlining the roles and responsibilities of the various stakeholders. And the purpose of the Racy is to clearly show the relationships between the various stakeholders, the interaction between these stakeholders, and the roles that each stakeholder plays in completion of this whole risk management effort. Right, that's the whole goal, is to manage the risk for medical devices, and so this Racy shows all that. And it really just stands for responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. And running through the document and trying to create these is very difficult because everyone has a difference of opinion on this. So the document doesn't have to be fully, not everyone is going to have a letter. Let me put it that way. And some people might, or individuals or groups might have more than one letter. So don't be scared to just wing it, right? Throw it out there, fill it in the best of your ability, and pass it around the stakeholders. Because what will ultimately happen is everyone thinks someone else should be responsible, accountable, and informed with different things. So you're probably going to go through several iterations and passes to be able to get it well refined. But it is that key piece of document, or that key document to have when things go wrong or when you need to make changes, when things need to happen, that everyone is aware of what's happening. Perfect. So with that, we come to the end of our discussion here. And so do we have any questions?
So again, by way of reminder, if you have a question, you can go ahead and enter it in the chat. In the meantime, I just had a question. I was interested in clarifying, or rather, given that now given 3 presentations on device security. I know they were on or rather on information security as a whole. And I know there were specific topics. If there was one major takeaway that, the next time we're sitting at a table with significant decision makers, that you would want to make sure that we get across or advocate, should we be part of an organization or a group or a team that isn't maybe taking security as seriously as they might, what would that one cogent talking point be, or thing that you would want us to make sure we recall from our time with you? We'll put Carrie on the spot first.
Okay.
That's actually an easy one, because I ask it all the time to my peers when we're in meetings, and it's just a straight up question. Do you know the level of risk that the medical devices in your organization are presenting? So we all have a handle on what our level of risk is. We all have to have cyber insurance. Believe me, I used to get to do the 90-page presentation once a year to our broker. But when you're talking about contextualizing risk, I might know that our workstations are adding maybe 2% of the level of risk to the organization. That's very low. It's probably closer to 22, but we have to keep some secrets. But if somebody asked me, do I have any idea of the level of risk that the medical devices sitting in all of the hospitals across Ascension Health was 5 years ago, I wouldn't have been able to answer that question. And it's not been a priority for people. So I think just thinking about, do you know what the level of risk is? If you don't have a tool or you haven't done some kind of an assessment, the answer is no. So they're going to get even less sleep than they were before, which is always my goal when I'm with my peers for security. I think I don't sleep a lot. They shouldn't sleep a lot. And believe me, we don't. But it's one more piece of the puzzle. Do they know the level of risk? I'm going to guarantee the answer is no.
Thank you. That's excellent. Yeah.
To the other side of it is the level of effort. I think understanding the resources required. We talked about controls and we talked about these things, but every time I have conversations with CISOs, they're kind of like, well, you expect me to have somebody sit here and do this all day? And so no, we don't. The idea is if you can multidimensional approach and partitioning off some of the pieces to the different team members and getting all the team members to come together. The biggest challenge is getting everyone to come together to have a realization that we have a problem. No one really sees it as a problem because maybe they haven't really been affected yet. But we're seeing more and more organizations becoming affected. We're seeing it in the news and headlines regularly now. I mean, it's one after another. So as your leaders start to see this and view this, they're starting to ask questions, right? So as nursing knows more about, oh, this is a reality, like people can die and we have to turn, availability of care is diminished. Okay, well, what can we do about that? So getting those individuals involved is a real piece of it. So the level of effort, it does take some time and a lot of building to get there. But once you have it and you have that whole process kind of embedded, you have it in the operations, right? The day-to-day normalcy of doing PMs or doing this, doing that, it becomes a lot less strenuous. The level of effort really diminishes, and then it's just ingrained as a process throughout day-to-day activities.
All right, thank you. So we have 2 questions here in the chat. So the first one is, how do you feel about keeping the IT CMDB separate from the CMMS platform?
Sorry, I'm talking on mute. They have to stay separate. So I would never suggest combining them. What we're talking about is making sure the data in all of those platforms match into one source of truth. And so if you look at your CMS database, it probably has device type, model number. It should have a link to the MDS2. It's basic information about what that clinical engineer would need to know to go out and do a PM on that physical device. But if you looked at that device from maybe a basic network scan, it's going to have more information. It might have the operating system. It might have an IP address. If you put a tool that's specifically looking at medical devices, it's going to give you that and a lot more. It's going to tell you what vulnerabilities exist on this device, what security risk exists on that device. So you want to have your tool on one side, your CMS database on the other side, and use your CMDB in the middle to create the complete record.
Thank you. All right, and then the other question we have is, do we need an overlay passive scanning tool, or can we rely on core wired and wireless networking gear, Cisco, for example, to gather medical device inventory?
Ooh, can I answer that?
Yes.
So those tools do work. So like one organization where I came from, there was a point in time where the IT folks were trying to utilize a Cisco IS product to profile medical devices. And it was such a difficult, time-consuming process of, hey, let's go over and test this EKG, and we can look at the attributes of this EKG. We'll send this much data. Okay, cool. We know what it looks like. Now we know what the other 40 or 50 look like. And okay, cool. So we have EKG now. Now let's go to the ultrasound. And it was so time-consuming. Well, these passive scanning solution tools can actually integrate through API with those tools that you're referring to. So having that integration actually allows the passive scanning tool to profile and give that other tool all the data it needs, and vice versa. Some of them are bi-directional, but the passive scanning really does a profound job, a beautiful job at really profiling these. So it gets very granular. I mean, when you're talking about a medical device and you can get the application version of a very specific medical device that some of these tools can award and pull, your Cisco, Aruba, whatever tools you may have will never get that granular, never get that close. But being able to get it from those passive scanning tools, like I said, can then pass over to your tools, and then now you have a full profile in the tools that you have. So yes and no. It's how manually do you want and granular do you want to get? And I think from playing on both sides of the fence here, the more granularity, the better. These tools provide everything from host names to AE titles to everything that you might have sitting in a spreadsheet or biomed or someone might have in all these different areas. So being able to disperse that from one tool into your other databases and tools is a really, really key element. But it's doable with what you have. Just not a lot of fun.
All right. Well, excellent. I think we've got to all the questions, and seeing that we're at the end of the hour, want to be respectful of folks' time. So we'll go ahead and bring it to a close and say thank you very much to Matt and to Carrie for presenting today and for our other two sessions. And so thank you also to our members for attending. Please know that we look forward to other webinar events with you, and you can see those advertised on our website, MinnesotaHIMSS.chapter.org, or MN.HIMSS chapter.org. Thank you all and have a wonderful day. Goodbye.
Thank you.